We're coming to a turning point in the Course. It's a little hard to see unless you step back from it. But we're coming to a place now where, in the lessons particularly, you can see he's beginning just now he's beginning to ask us now more to be willing to witness rather than just take in the information. So where are you with being able or being willing to be a witness? The lovely thing is that we're only asked to be willing to stay in that place. Even though sometimes, most of the time for me, I'm not in that place. I'm only thinking about being in that place. But that's all I'm asked to do. The rest of it is what is the hardest part. And that's to allow the Holy Spirit to step in. To step out enough to allow the Holy Spirit to step in. That's always the hardest thing for us, because all of our senses are directed toward what we see in our world. And then we believe that that's what we have to respond to. We have still no idea, but this is what we're being asked now to start to witness to. But we have no real idea that what we are witnessing to now is our own creation. There's nothing out here that we haven't made. Absolutely nothing. Love is the one feeling, and we all admit that love we share with one another here. We haven't quite gotten to the level of the love of God yet. But even so, the love that we share with one another is the one feeling that allows us to overlook anything. And so it becomes the basis for forgiveness. When you are loving someone, you can step away from their behavior. But when you are not, you can't. Love is this feeling that transcends that allows you to communicate the most clearly that you possibly could. The fact that your love is stronger than their guilt.
But would they hear that from me?
Yeah, that's not our job. Our job is not to determine whether or not they are willing to do something. Only whether or not we are willing to be a witness in that place of loving. I can remember probably the most constant thing Brother talking to me about is, particularly when I was doing some work in the prisons and so forth, saying constantly, the one thing that you can absolutely depend on for anyone that you meet is that they want to know that they are loved and capable of loving. So how many opportunities did we have this past week to be that witness to loving?
Every time we see someone.
Every time we even think of them, Sam.
Yeah.
Even think of them. And are you in this world? No. But inasmuch as you think you are in this world, where will you find God in this world?
In the love of others, I think.
Or yourself?
For yourself, yeah.
If the Holy Spirit, the extension of God or God's idea in the world, is to work, is to be a witness to anything in the world, how does that happen without us?
Does it?
It doesn't.
No. That's what I was thinking.
It doesn't. That's why Brother constantly tells us, be the Holy Spirit's witness in the world. Be that presence of love so that the presence of God's love can be known in the world. That's our job. That's our function. It's the only function we have, to be the presence of God's love in the world, because we think that we are in the world. How can we do that? We do that by learning to ask constantly, to where asking and receiving the answer becomes habitual. Brother was even telling Helen when she went shopping for clothes to ask. Make it the habit of listening that power of God, even to the extent of denying God. Isn't that amazing? We have all the power of God because we are a part of God. And then we use that power to deny God, deny the presence, being the presence of the love of God. It's trying to teach us to ask and ask and ask and ask to the point that we have total confidence that when we ask, it's there.
It's done.
It's not even a matter of listening. It's just knowing it's there. And that's where the lessons and the text, where the lessons and text are coordinated, are beginning to turn now. We've gone from the information stage to the witness stage. So please watch for that, because so many times we have the tendency simply to keep wanting to take in information, not recognize that we are being asked to do something with it. Here we are, all beings within one mind. Okay? There's only one mind. So what makes us either recognize or not recognize what's happening in that one mind? What? It's just our belief. That's how powerful our belief is, incidentally, but it is just our belief. So I talk to this dead guy all the time. You know? So why shouldn't you?
Yeah.
Why shouldn't any of us freely communicate with anyone anywhere? It's only our belief that creates a concept called death.
Yeah.
And that, incidentally, we've talked about this before, but that's where our consciousness is going now. Our consciousness, right at this particular time, is trying to make up its mind whether or not it is safe enough not to have to escape from God. Because that's what we use death for. It's that since we associate ourselves being a body, we think that when we die, we're gone. We can go somewhere where we can really hide. We thought that way about coming into the body too, so we play both ends of the thing against the middle. But anyway, this is where our consciousness is going. This is the decision we're trying to make right now. So the more of us who would like to see us come around that corner to where we can be in a body or be not in a body, but we don't go through the sickness and death routine anymore, I begin to think that way. That's what changes our consciousness. It is just the way we think by consensus.
Can you talk about witnessing?
That is an interesting subject. All of us think of witnessing as we envision ourselves being in the world. But the real witnessing that any of us do is solely a mental process. It is allowing ourselves to be open to the state of mind that we call the Christ mind. Anytime that we step back from the ego consciousness and open ourselves to the Christ mind, we have literally moved the direction that the ego consciousness takes. It's watching the transition between the ego consciousness, between separateness and wholeness. It's the term itself, witnessing, is being a presence within the consciousness that allows that transition to come into fruition.
So I have to, and in that is letting go of all my opinions and preferences and judgments, perception.
Yeah, you can't hold them any. I mean, you wouldn't want to. There isn't any question about letting them go. They're gone, and that's what makes the transition.
And that's what makes it, yeah. So it's stepping back from all of that.
Yeah. But the delightfully wonderful thing about all of this is that it all happens because of our intention. When I say step back, when I say become a witness, just go to the God self and say, this is what I want to do, and allow that then to happen for you, to be done for you, to take you there, to do whatever needs to be done. And it's when we become a witness to opening our mind, to not resisting the will of God, that transition all occurs. We don't have to really do anything. We use the term to do something, but we're never really doing anything. We're either resisting something or we are opening our mind to allowing what's there to come through. We are not in a state of mind to accept, as he's saying here, to accept seeing what the problem is. So I can say, what does being separate have to do with me sitting here paying the bills? But the state of mind that I'm in while I'm sitting here, seeming to be separate from the one I'm paying the bill to, could be an entirely different issue. We don't know, is what I'm saying. It's what he's saying in this lesson. You simply don't know. So develop the habit of asking. Develop the habit of asking to the extent that you positively anticipate the answer, and it will be there. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's the earth-shattering answer that's going to change your life. It is simply going to be the answer that in this moment helps you best to recognize that you are in the presence of the love of God. If we are to recognize what the problem is, this is a really key thing to understand. We are not afraid of how does he say it?
Disassociation.
You're afraid of your disassociation, not of what you have disassociated. Dissociated.
That word kind of just doesn't make. What word do we substitute for?
Try denied.
Deny.
If we're associating with something, we're connecting somehow to it. If we disassociate with it, we're denying in a sense that we're connected to it at all.
Good, yeah, that's clear.
So we're back to separation.
Yes. I don't know, some time ago, Brother gave me a new definition for a quiet mind. I always used to think of trying to have my meditations without any thought, and rarely was I successful. And so I was asking him how to go about correcting this. And he said, let me give you a different definition for a quiet mind. He said, your mind now appears to be filled because it is filled with conflicting thoughts. But allow your mind to be filled with the thought of God, and it will in truth be filled, but it will all be very quiet. So it's not the content that determines whether or not we have a quiet mind. It's whether or not the mind is all in attune with its loving self or at odds with it. Knowing that we are the consciousness of the universe today, knowing that, how would you best feel that you could change your own mind about the purpose of death? Yeah, in other words, what purpose does death serve for you? Here we are, the consciousness that is in the process of letting go of the need to die. But that letting go is going to depend entirely on our willingness for it to happen. And our individual experience is going to depend upon how open we are to seeing it in another. So the question, again, for you individually, what would be the best way for you to demonstrate to yourself that death served no purpose for you?
Well, it has to be another way out of hell then. Death is a release from the agonies of this world.
That's the purpose the ego would seem to give it. But there's a step beyond that, a step deeper than that, let's say. And that's the step that I'm trying to excavate now. If it is impossible, in fact, for us to die, and yet we still go through this process that we call life, what's the difference between life and death? while we're sitting here right now, we are supposedly in a condition we call living. Now may come a moment when that thought changes to something else that we're going to call death. And then there will be another moment that will be what? Am I able to communicate what I'm trying to say? If this is a moment of living, and I'm doing whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking whatever I'm thinking, my mind is functioning however it's functioning, and then I reach that moment that we call death, just beyond that is another moment. And now keep in mind, we can't die, so what is that moment? And what separates this moment from that moment?
Thought of time.
That's the thought of time that I'm trying to get to. How that linear thought of time to time seems to be disrupted by a moment that is only a moment in the experience of living. Yeah, that's what eternity is. It's just, then we go into another moment. But again, all of these moments are nothing more than thoughts in mind that seem to occur in a sequential fashion that we call time. I'm trying to move down that path on the outside of the story. If we were able to conceptualize just what we've been saying here in different ways, that there are these moments that we have a name for, and we just backed away and looked at each of those individual moments and said, what if there was no need to disconnect them?
It's life, part of life.
What if we had, then it would all be,
Life.
and I don't want to get caught in this, but it would all be what we're now calling life.
Yeah.
But those individual moments that we call death and birth and death and birth don't need to be connected like. Oh, what I'm talking about is the miracle. See, again, let me connect this, keep this connected now, so that we can all stay on the same page, because it's a little difficult. We're recognizing that we are the consciousness that is moving through the process of letting go of the concept we now call death. Our mind will not tackle that concept until it has some measure of relating to what that concept is. It may not have to be exactly the truth of the concept, but until it has some moment, some relative relationship to that moment, then we are still going to want to lean toward preserving the concept of dying. In other words, we're trying to get ourselves over that hump, that this is an outside force being levied upon us, as opposed to a choice that we're all making. And now we're asking ourselves, are we willing to make another choice? Brother says all of us have had that moment. When I ask him about how to, that's beyond what I can comprehend. No. That's a belief system. You have had that moment. Everyone has had that moment. And sometimes it is only a moment. But we have had it. So what we're trying to do is to get to that point where we can relate to it, where we can accept that that moment does exist in our mind, and open the mind then into the process, and it will be a process, the process of relating to the experience of it. Right now, if I were to say, and as I have said, there's no need to die, what does that mean? What does that mean? Do you consciously, are you able to relate to a moment where you can recognize that you have never died? That going from that moment that you call life to death to life It's just something that needs a thought to bridge those moments together. There isn't any need for us to separate our moments of living and not living and living from the goal of awakening, and let it all become a function of the awakening process. I remember that experience I had of a friend of mine being on the phone with a friend of mine, and he was asking me the questions about Jesus at the time of his death. And I just suddenly had this vision in my mind of him being on the cross and the others who were on crosses adjacent to him and so forth. And I knew he was still alive, and I knew he was going through the process of taking his last breath. And the thought went through my mind, well, you'll know when he dies because there will be this wonderful flash of light. And instead what happened was there was a moment when the cross just faded to nothing and he was there and the world disappeared. And it was just like, oh my God, the only thing real in this whole scenario is me. We need to begin to pay attention to what he's saying about these are beliefs so firmly fixed. In other words, these are the foundation of our self-image. To help you understand they are based on nothing. What is he really saying to us here? Is there anything that our perception can perceive that has any meaning at all?
I think of them-
Immediately we're being asked to let go of the very foundation of our belief about who we are. And if we don't see that, if we don't really consider that possibility, we're going to miss the point entirely. We're being asked not so much to judge that as just to allow the foundation of our belief to be shaken. Just to allow that belief, allow the mind to be a little bit more open to explore another belief. Okay, if you get caught up in the first one, which is what we have a tendency to do, then you're going to get stuck there. Because we're very, very quick to make judgment about our own beliefs. But if we get caught in those judgments, then that's where we're going to get hooked. And that's not the point of all of this. This lesson is designed to shake up our beliefs enough to allow what is true to begin to come through. It's to create that willingness so that what is really already there can begin to seep through the cracks. If it's true, there's nothing for you to learn. There's no great revelations. It's just to allow the belief that's there to be shaken. That's not an easy one. The idea that it is not our responsibility to fix our brother is both true and false. It is true that it is not our ego's responsibility to fix anything because it doesn't know anything. But it is also true that it is our responsibility to be a witness to what is true about us. That is, in fact, our mission. That is our purpose, to be a witness to what is true. So we are asked to fix our brother by holding an image of truth about him. But we don't do that from the ego's perspective. It could be by any number of means. It might perfectly be to say something to them. But what to say, how to say it, would come from the God Self who is orchestrating the process.
Yeah.
This is what we're really examining. Are we willing, literally, to turn away from our own belief, everything that we've ever thought was true, and say, this isn't true. Sin is not real. My innocence is guaranteed by God. So look back across the history of your experience, whether it's personal experience or historical, and look at all of the terrible people and the terrible wrongs that have been committed in the world. Are you willing to just step away from those and say, no, didn't happen. Just part of my story. It didn't happen. There's nothing there for me. Are you willing to do that? That's why this lesson is so pivotal. Because until we do that, nothing that you're going to read in this book or read in these following lessons is going to be anything except just a wild belief. But this is what will really change your mind. This is the crossroads, so to speak. And I don't know how many times I've read this lesson and had never recognized that. And just let myself go on. But it's time now for all of us to really ask ourselves whether or not we are at the point where we're willing to let go of our belief, to let go of this entire self-image. I went into a meditation this morning after I had finished this lesson. A little bit later on, he asks us to try to meet up with the God self, the God-created self, and see the difference between that self and the ego self that we have made, the character that we've created in this story that we're telling. And it was amazing. It was amazing. After, 30 years, seeing that and literally fighting my way through.
Did you feel like you were really moving into the mind of God?
Yes, absolutely. That's the only place there is to go. And if you can't go there, what? This self does not exist at all. For us to really get the advantage of knowing the working of forgiveness, this is what we have to see. We have to literally be able to see that self that we've been judging is gone. Now, why would this be so beneficial? You recall the world we see is generated by our mind, the inner images in our mind. So everything we see now that makes this world what it seems to be comes from these images, which are all founded on the reality of sin. So if we learn to step aside from these beliefs in mind, then literally the world we see is going to change. Kind of an awesome thought, isn't it? It doesn't just exist that way because that's the way it is. It exists that way because that's the way we think it is. And as soon as we start thinking of it from a different point of view, it will change. Our whole understanding of oneness pivots around exactly that awareness. That you can't do something for yourself alone. It's impossible. But that's why we are where we think we are. That is the foundation for this world. And it's also the foundation for the concept that sin is real. Everything that happens to everyone. Just learn to start thinking about it in that way. That's the way it is. Because they're a part of you. If you're thinking of it as them, they are a part of you. It's not exactly the way it is, but the thing that allow that awareness, not to challenge it, but to allow that awareness to become something helpful. To go to the God self and say, what does this really mean for me? And allow it to be a pivotal issue that becomes helpful. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there. That saying, there are no accidents, that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true about every thought that comes through your mind. We witness by seeing. So if we are to experience our wholeness, that would mean for me to see your wholeness. Now I've become a witness to your wholeness. I've become a witness to you being a part of God. So you are a part of everything. But I can't do that and still judge Donald Trump. Because in essence, what we're saying is we are changing the way we see. It's not about me seeing you one way and somebody else another way. It's changing the way I see, which changes everything. The way we make the transition from the God out there to the God within is through the recognition that there's only one mind. We have to begin to open up to the possibility of understanding a little bit differently what that mind is and how it functions and the purpose that it serves and how it can seem to serve a different purpose for different people. But that's the only mind. It's the only thinking mechanism there is. So how far away are you going to be from God? How far away are we from one another at any given moment? And yet, as we begin to judge, there's an interesting thing that happens. We literally insert a wall of belief between us and any other mind. And so there suddenly seems to be a multitude of minds, all different, all pursuing different goals. And yet, when we really tune in, when we remember those moments when we've had the ahas and literally said, oh, well, maybe there is just one mind. When we remember those, we can more easily reset ourselves and our thinking to reconnecting, recognizing that the only thing that changed was I had a different thought. I put up a different barricade, a different wall. And suddenly something seemed to be different. Obviously, always easy to fall back on separation because separation is our creation. And until we recognize that our creation and God's creation are exactly the same thing, we will continue to want to favor the ego, creation. And what is it that helps us recognize that our creation and God's creation is the same thing? Only one thing helps us. That's our connection to the Holy Spirit. That's the thought that God put in our mind for that specific sole purpose. Bridging the gap, so-called, that we perceive, the gap that we perceive at least, between us and between us and God.
Along that line, Dom, on page 628, 14, chapter 14, Jesus uses the term "we," and I just couldn't get that.
I would suggest to you, Sam, there are two things that can happen, that do happen. Not frequently, but do happen throughout the course. One is that in the process of Helen's hearing and in the process of the editing by the people just like us, the wrong words were chosen. They're imperfect. I've been having an interesting experience myself this week. A couple of months ago, maybe somewhat longer, we began to discuss the idea of dying, or the validity of the idea of dying, let's say. And we've talked about it off and on in different groups since then. Today, while Linda and John were out for a walk, I was having a little conversation with Brother. And I said to him, well, I haven't thought to ask you, but why does this idea seem to be so up for me? Why do I seem to be pursuing it? And he said, perhaps you've been listening. So we talked about it for a little while. And what he's saying to me is that it is time for us now to begin to consciously adopt a different motivation for how we are seeing this idea we call death. Because the consciousness is, in fact, in the process of letting it go. And the more we are able to direct our attention, open our mind to that movement of consciousness, the more the transition will happen, the more quickly the transition will happen, and much more peaceful. So I said, well, how would we get started on that? And he said, well, you did this morning, and that's irrelevant to most people. But what Linda, a couple of days ago, said she just happened onto the teacher's manual and just happened to open up to the page which explores what is death. And he is very specific there, very, very specific. So I would suggest that that's where we go today to get our group started. Death is the central dream from which all illusions stem. So when that tiny mad idea entered the mind of God's Son, it came clothed in a concept that we are now calling death. It is the one thing that we have always refused to question that makes the idea of sin and separation appear to be absolutely valid. Any doubts about that? How many of us have even looked to the idea of death as a way of bringing peace?
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. If we needed a nap in between these so-called incarnations, then God would have created death to be real. If it had served some purpose, then God would have made it real. But if it serves no purpose for God, if it does not exist in the mind of God, it can serve no purpose for us.
Death is an illusion.
Yes, it is. And that's what we're trying to make of it now. Not this hard-boiled certainty as the one thing that we cannot overcome, but to challenge that, literally, to challenge that and to insist that it is our story and we can change it.
I like that statement. Swear not to die, you holy Son of God. It's a promise you cannot keep.
Death is the symbol of the fear of God. Now, why would that be? It could only be because we believe that death is God's making. These are the beliefs that we're clinging to. As long as we try to maintain the story of this world and the bodies in this world and the beliefs that make that all seem possible. To me, that means simply, if I believe that I can change what was God's creation of eternal life, I've changed it all. And none of it is real. That's the foundation, that's the firmament around which we try to maintain our belief that sin and separation are real. He's essentially describing the dualistic beliefs that we are both body and spirit. That's one of the fundamentals of the dualistic way of thinking. And he's saying how curious it would be, what an attempt it is to make the body real by simply saying, but the spirit goes on. Yeah. So you see, you are first proclaiming that the body is real for spirit to then go on. And in truth, there was no body. The body is not real. And is not a part of God's creation, but a part of our story. That's the guts of our belief. It's hard for us all. What is the one thing that you can think of that there would be no disagreement?
That love is real.
Thank you. Thank you. And so each time that he says here that if we are to believe that the idea of death is real, we can't relate that to a loving presence of God.
If we don't fear death, or see it as an awful thing.
But then there's no purpose. There's still no purpose for it.
No, I agree. There would be no purpose for it. There is no purpose.
No, that's what we're being asked to consider. Is there some purpose, some reason for which we would use death?
Recycle the tiny mad ideas.
When are we going to be done with that idea? What it means to think that if we can die, then to be a part of what created us able to die, how can you then think of the Creator as being eternal? I can tell you that what he has said is that it's already done. Yeah, the story is over, has been from the first time it was told. That's not satisfying to the linear way of thinking. But if you are an everlasting, eternal person, then linear thinking is irrelevant. What he told me earlier this afternoon was, what makes you so certain that when you change your mind about the reality of death, that you won't discover you have always been alive? And it's like, well, yeah, where else do you go then? Yeah, what does that look like? What I'm saying is that I don't think we can try to promulgate our awareness or to pursue our awareness along the same line that we now are and expect the same outcome if we change this concept of dying. Everything changes then. All of it. There obviously is still some purpose that this concept, the tiny mad idea, is serving for us. The tiny mad idea of separation and sin being real and death. There's obviously some purpose being served, which is why we have, in our story, we have made the idea of death to be the one thing that we don't question. Maybe what I'm getting out of it is that all we need to do is to question it. We don't have to accept it as even as our belief now, but we have to bring it up, ask ourselves whether or not we are willing to see it differently. Well, if it's true, then we don't need to do anything with it. We don't need to wrestle it. We don't need to try to bring it into view. We don't need to try to do anything with it. If it's real, if it's true, that's it. All we need to do is to remove the blocks to our awareness. That's it. Teacher of God, your one assignment could be stated thus: accept no compromise in which death plays a part. My one assignment, my one purpose, accept no compromise in which death plays a part. Do not believe in cruelty, nor let attack conceal the truth from you. What seems to die has but been misperceived and carried to illusion. Now it becomes your task to let the illusion be carried to the truth. Be steadfast, but in this. Be not deceived by the reality of any changing form. Truth neither moves, nor wavers, nor sinks down to death and dissolution. And what is the end of death? Nothing but this: the realization that the Son of God is guiltless now and forever. Nothing but this. But do not let yourself forget, it is not less than this. There's nothing but this. Feel the impact of that. Nothing but this. The Son of God is guiltless now and forever. This is what we are being asked to become a witness to. And when I said, what can I tell the group about what we can do? He said, spend a day, pick a day, spend a day noticing every thought that comes to your mind that is dependent upon the idea of death, and call it then into question. I think each of us will put it into the perspective that it suits us best, that's most meaningful for us. But I am struck by how impactful it could be if this group sitting here today said, it is possible for us to awaken from a dream that is impossible to be true. We are the Son of God, like it or not. Maybe that's a bigger part of it than we recognize, like it or not. Maybe we just need to learn to like it.
There's something, Could be the ego nagging at me, but it was, as we were describing this, it was a sense of boredom. So if you said, swear not to be born, you Son of God, so we're never going to see a newborn baby, we're never going to see puppies, we're never going to see anything born, we're never going to see life. It's the same.
Well,
swear not to be born is
it's
the
not
same.
quite the same. Not quite the same, actually, because it is the nature of creation to extend itself, which is a similar type thing we're talking about, being born, so to speak. Not numerically, again, not age-wise. That love always must extend itself. So it's not quite the same as the dying. The dying says something different than the being born.
But something's born wasn't there before. It's not eternal.
Not necessarily.
Yes, it was.
We don't recognize.
Yeah, in
The
our
body
recognition.
was there. The body wasn't there before. The spirit was.
It's hard for us to, unless we haven't experienced something of some nature like you're talking about, it's hard for us to even contemplate that without, using you for an example, without your desire to be a hero, to do what you were wanting to do, would the event have ever occurred? See, most of us still want to pattern our thinking along the lines of, how would I respond? Would I respond differently to an event than I might right now or that I would have in the past? But we aren't quite ready to take the step yet that says that event wouldn't have been there without my desire to participate, without my setting the stage to see, quote unquote, see what had happened, there wouldn't have been anything to happen. If we were able to take the same awareness that we have, which is that we create our own experience in the world based upon the thoughts and the thinking process, how similar is that to creation?
It's the same.
Have you ever thought about it from that standpoint? Yeah. So how similar is our thinking process now to what would be required to emulate creation? What would we have to do? I'm not talking about in a full-blown way, but even as an ego, what would we have to do to prepare our thinking to see the parallel with our mind to creating as God's mind creates creation? I'm sorry, say again.
Experience the atonement.
Keep
Say
asking.
a little bit more about that.
Well, I think what you're talking about is the difference between projection and extension.
Yes, that's according to the Course's terms. That's true.
So if I extend them in the egoic consciousness, and if I extend them in the spiritual, then the way to get from one to the other is the atonement.
So what kind of a state of mind would I have to be in that would allow the experience or the expression of that atonement to become my world?
State of mind to be seeing the world with Christ's vision.
What would that be like?
I have no idea.
Isn't it?
Yeah, you do.
You really do.
I'm surprised you're asking me. Yes.
I just asked the one that I know knows. I'm asking the one that I know who knows. Isn't it also a conscious commitment to acknowledge that this is what we want? For instance, Linda, John, and I were discussing this morning. One of our favorite expressions is God's will for us is perfect happiness. What is perfect happiness to you? Have you stopped to try to put a focus on that? Truly, I mean, let's face it, if we can't acknowledge what perfect happiness is for us, odds are it's not going to really come our way, because we've just been talking about what creates our experience. It's the conscious recognition that our thoughts are what is creating for us. So if I am not consciously aware of what causes my happiness, what are the chances of my having it? Let me ask you this. Are you willing to intentionally be a part of God?
I think so.
Good. Assuming the role, many times, most of the time, is quite different. We can talk about it. We can read about it. We can feel good. We can have experiences of feeling euphoric. But how about on a moment-to-moment basis, the way we identify ourselves? Can we sit here now and consciously say, I will myself to be a part of God. I will myself to be the essence of creation. Does that feel strange? To the ego it does, because the ego is saying that is being, as we used to say, egotistical. That it is a very high priority of the teaching of A Course in Miracles to teach us how to be godlike with our split mind. Because I think you're right. I think that there are times when it's nearly inescapable. We just find ourselves falling back into the hole. But then the response that we make is usually pretty inevitable too, isn't it? It's to criticize ourselves. It's to say, oh, I can't do this. I fall short here and I do this and I do that. What if none of that we were able to criticize? What if we could just look at every one of those experiences and say, wow, what a lovely opportunity. What a lovely opportunity. Even if it was only for me to be able to say, there is another way. Mm-hmm. Let me see it differently. Brother told us a couple of weeks ago, you're always on the highway to loving. Sometimes you get picked up by a good thought, a loving thought, and sometimes not, but you're always on the highway. That's the feeling. What would we judge someone else for if we could catch ourselves? Even if we made the judgment, how much more of an advantage would it be to just step back and say, wow, that was a beautiful opportunity.
Too bad I didn't take it.
Jim, that's the ego's response. That's the one that chokes us. Now, what if, instead of waking up in the morning and saying, God, what can I do for you today? We woke up and said, God, I'm willing to accept your will for me today. I am willing to be perfectly happy today. I am willing to be perfectly happy today. Teach me. Can we do that? Would you feel comfortable in doing that? Let me try to be more clear. I don't care if it's your ego being happy. I really don't look at that as a big drawback. There's something within us that resists being happy. Whether you call it the ego self or the God self, whatever it is, it's the self you identify with. That self. Don't try to decide if that's the ego or the God self. Just whatever self you happen to be that morning, in that moment, that self, are you willing to be perfectly happy? Do you think God wants that self to be perfectly happy? Yes. Yes. Yes, you bet. Maybe we could do an experiment next week. On the mornings that you remember, ask simply the God self, show you how to be perfectly happy that day. And then watch during the day what happens. And obviously it'll be helpful if you remind yourself periodically throughout the day that what you are willing to be is perfectly happy. And watch the things, as I say, watch the things that bring that feeling of happiness to you without any expectation. No rights, no wrongs, nothing more spiritually correct than something else. Just the whole point being our willingness to be happy. Whatever self we identify, our willingness to be happy. So let's ask ourselves, if when that moment of truth arrives and all of the other thoughts are gone, why didn't that moment arrive in the beginning? How did we ever start all this mess? And I asked that question this morning because it was really troubling me. I said, how could this have happened? And Brother said, The short story is, it didn't. Oh, okay. It didn't. What happened was that we fell into a state of dreaming, but nothing happened. The revelation of what that means is so significant. It tells us that right now, at any moment that we choose, all of this that has been held for us on the back burner, so to speak, exists right now, and we can simply say, I choose to have it now. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. The mind of God's Son is as pure as it has ever been. The dream has affected nothing. We were all rather curious about how he was, or what he actually meant by finding the world to be safe, and why he would even be talking about it, because most of the time he talks about letting go of the world. So we asked Brother what he was talking about, asking him what he meant by the phrase of the world being safe. And he said, it is part of your learning that love is indestructible. Then we started thinking, well, what is he really talking about in that regard? And then we have to remember that we are the ones who make the world. And when we make the world from one perspective, one mindset, let's say, it can look like one thing, and when we make it from a different mindset, it can look like something else. So he goes on to say, the problem is the meaning you have imposed upon the world, which fulfills the image of a separated sinful self. He says there is no difference between the world you see and the heaven that is God's home, other than your willingness to see and to accept the love that is your creation. When you see the self God created you to be, there is nothing for you to see that will not reflect His presence, which is a very interesting way now to see and think about the world. Never forget, without you, creation does not exist. What you see of yourself is what creation actually is. When you see the self that sin created, your vision is confined to what I have referred to as ego-seeing. But when you see through love's reflection, this is what we have called Christ's vision. Your choice is to decide clearly which you want to see. And that's where he stopped. But I had this feeling the whole time I was listening to him. There is no world until I see it. There's nothing there until I see it, until I put it there. That was the clearest awareness I've ever had of what he continuously tells us, are creating the world we see. But literally, it was so clear at that moment that there's nothing there until we see it. Think about that. Think about the reality of that. What kind of power does that give us to recreate the world? The more I tried to contemplate that, the more I found myself resisting that we have that kind of power. How do you feel about it? Is that a good feeling or not so good? I mentioned to you that the first 5 days that I did our little exercise, they were beautiful. And these last 2 days, I wake up and start to go through the litany of God, please help me to be willing to accept your will for me today. And my voice then comes through and says, I think you've had about enough. So my ego is the one that says, you can only go so far with this happiness business.
You ever had a dream where you woke up and you wish you hadn't?
This, incidentally, is what we've been talking about for several weeks now. And the reason that the consciousness is so deeply engaged in letting go of the idea of death, because when closer you come to it, the more you see that the idea of death itself is what perpetuates the dream. It's what perpetuates the idea that you can dream. Because it stops and then it starts and it stops and it starts. What are we going to be faced with when we finally can acknowledge there's no point in stopping and starting? There is no stopping and starting. Ultimately, it must bring you to the conclusion that there is no sin. And he tells us so many times, so many different places, it's that single concept. It's the one idea of sin upon which all of our illusions are based. Now, just for a moment, why would that mean that love could not judge? If it saw everything like itself, how could it judge? What is there to judge except something that seems to be apart, separate, distinct from you?
If it judged, it wouldn't be love.
No.
There is not one principle the world upholds that violates the truth of what love is.
Did you look for things that you felt about the world that would make that untrue? Does this not challenge all of our beliefs that there's something here for us to hold on to? And let's be honest. If we didn't find anything here to hold on to, it'd be gone. It wouldn't be here.
So I wonder if it would be appropriate to say that if you looked at it through Christ's vision, if you looked at the same thing, you'd find something that you want very much.
That would be seeing it in a different way, Raj. And keep in mind what he says constantly is it's not about letting the world go. It's about letting the world you see. So we're always, as you were just pointing out, if you were to see the world through the vision of Christ, what would there be to let go of? It's the thought that gives rise to the idea of an ego, something separate from you, some way of seeing differently that somehow is incomplete. If you saw whatever you see through the vision or with the vision of Christ, is automatically a part of you.
I wonder if it would be more helpful to ask the Holy Spirit to help me see that way, rather than to focus on letting go of the negative.
I think it would be very much helpful, Raj.
The Course seems to spend a lot of time letting go of the negative.
Yeah.
I suppose they're both necessary.
Well, because we approach it differently, yeah. Some of us are going to relate to it this way and some that. But it's the same. It goes to the same place. Do you suppose it could be because we recognize that it's our own creation, and as painful as it sometimes seems to be, nevertheless we know it, and it is familiar, and it is where we can feel our presence. Could we feel our presence if we were to abandon everything that we think is true and accept a world that we knew we didn't make? Could we feel okay about that? I think we have to ask ourselves that question, because until we do, there's going to seem to be something about letting go, about a different world, a real world, so to speak, that seems to be frightening. I caught myself one day in a meditation wondering about this and thinking, my God, if I did that, I would be without Linda. And immediately, I heard the voice come back and say, what makes you so sure that she is not with you? What makes you so sure that you are where you think you are? Where are we? Truly, where are we? Can we be somewhere other than where God is if we are a part of God? What does that tell us? That as soon as we separate ourselves from the feeling that we are a part of God, we're back in the story. No matter what else we seem to be doing, we separate ourselves from God and we create a fiction, a dream, a story.
The world I see holds nothing that I want.
Why does it feel like it does?
Because we've made it. It's our own creation. It's familiar. And even in our pain, that familiarity is comforting. But I am not a body. I am free. Do you want to be free? This doesn't mean there's anything bad about your body or bad about having or seeming to have a body now. It's not that. It's all about the simple craving to be free of the need to be separate. Just that.
We already are free, we just don't know.
Yes. And that's because we are already a part of everything that is. We think that because we play this silly game and tell this story that we make it true. Whenever we are in a state of mind that sees the world, sees being in quotes, that sees the world, you see everything that you have put into making up that world was that if you turn it over to the God self and saw the world from that perspective, what would the difference be? But you see, until we're willing to give all of this up that we now see, we're going to try to find something good about it that we can cling to. And that's going to keep us from seeing it in an entirely different way. When we see this world as we now see it, we are seeing sin and separation being real. The key issue that we'll be discussing today as we look at Lesson 135 is, to me, unquestionably the most significant obstacle for me to try to overcome personally. And that is a lack of trust in the God creation and more trust in my ego's beliefs. What does the Course tell us? We wouldn't have a single problem if we had trust. Can we truly forgive and not trust? How would that be? It doesn't seem to me that would be possible. My forgiveness would be pretty meaningless if I were trying to literally trying to forgive the thing that has happened, instead of recognizing that small voice that speaks and says, this isn't here. And yet, isn't it interesting that for all of us, the issue of trust seems to be so difficult, and yet at the same time, when we do, we recognize that it's truth. It seems like such a terrible dichotomy. If this trust thing is so important, how do I develop it? How do I get there? And he said, to practice using it. And I said, how do I do that? And he said, you learn to ask. You learn to rely on the asking rather than the ego's jumping in immediately and saying, do this, do that. So you begin to be able to relate to what happens when you ask, and then the effect of the asking is the feeling of peace and a lack of fear, I'm sure. Of all of the things that Brother has ever talked to me about, the one thing that I am less certain of and yet more certain of in another fashion is what happens before and after the thing we call dying. And he has always said, I can't explain it to you because you will always try to envision it from the point of view from which you feel the answer must come. And until you get to the place where you're completely open, where your mind has no expectation, will you ever be able to appreciate what it's like. But he said, I can tell you this, it's nothing like you think it is. When we recognize that death itself is impossible, that changes the mind, I think, significantly enough that we can come to understand this thing we call transition is probably a whole lot less like transition than it is like continuation. The whole image of having a body or not having a body is what's involved in the idea of death. But to the contrary, the only thing that separates life from death is not a body. It's the thought that there's something wrong with you. It's the thought that in the Course he calls sin, because the whole concept of separation is meaningless without the concept of sin. So we approach it from the standpoint of thinking of it as having or not having a body. And he encourages us to approach it thinking about having sin or having no sin. And that's why the idea, the concept of forgiveness is so significant in the book. Because every time we talk about sin in any form, his approach is always, this isn't real. This isn't really here. How many times does he tell us that you can't suffer pain? See, I can't relate to that. I have a disease, for Pete's sake. It's easy for you to say, maybe, but he'll say, you can't suffer. You can't have pain. And the point is, if I saw that from the perspective that sin was totally unreal, I could understand that. It would make perfect sense. Because it's only the experience of sin that creates the experience of pain. And it's only the experience of sin that allows us to justify the belief that separation is possible. And it's not. It's just not possible.
Strange that the word sin is a Latin word for without. Is Latin for without?
Yes.
Sin
Spanish
means
Means
without.
without. In the law, as you begin to study the law, that's one of the first translations that comes from the original Greek law, is the idea of sin. The word sin.
Well, it sounds as sin was just be a thought in the mind of God. Yeah,
Sin is not a thought in the mind of God.
The thought in the holy mind, the split mind.
Yes, in the split mind.
Okay. So if we let go of that thought, then what's left is the holy mind.
That's absolutely correct, Roger.
And that
How
is
could
so
it be that-
abstract.
But in another way, it's very specific. Now, how much more specific can you be than to say, take sin out of your mind, and your entire mind would change.
And that would be the only thing that I would be the mind. There would be nothing else.
That's all there is anyway, yeah.
That's what I have trouble getting my head around. Well, instead what I'm hearing you say is you can hear the voice and still have trouble with trust.
Yes, absolutely. If you were to ever hear some of the conversations we have, you would understand what I'm saying. In some ways, it makes it more difficult because suddenly you've given yourself an argument that you don't see how to combat. In other words, yeah, my self would say, well, how can you doubt? How could you not have trust when you hear the voice? And the fact of the matter is, I hear the voice and I still doubt. Lesson of the day before, where he says, don't expect to ever enter heaven alone. There's a lot of implication for me in that statement. It makes it a little more clear when I get so frustrated and I say to Brother, but you use your argument, if I hear the voice, and he'll say, this thing you call a mind is not just your mind. This thing you call a consciousness is not just your consciousness. This is the single mind, the single consciousness, of which every part of the Son of God is present. And the closer you get to recognizing, to being able to accept the truth of that, the harder it becomes for you to justify hearing what you hear, calling it mine, or saying, this is what I hear, as opposed to what you hear, or what happens with anyone else. And I resist that so strongly because, my goodness, if I am going to be held back by all of the crud, you see where we're going?
In everybody's mind.
That's it. But you see, that's the point.
That's the point, yeah.
That's the awakening process. The awakening process literally is nothing exists until I have thought it.
Yeah.
So all I have really going for me is the choice to say, I choose only love. And then all of that other stuff is gone.
Yeah.
You see? But that's not the point at which I can be comfortable right now.
So I choose to hear only love. Who's the I?
Well, that's the whole point, Raj. That's the whole point. I have to be able to be the I of every part of the Son of God. And then suddenly, see, that's what's so intriguing and yet so maddening at the same time. That's what happens when the idea of sin is gone from your mind and all of our thoughts begin to come from the place of being in union. Not being separate, being in union. And then everything changes to accommodate that. Just like now everything accommodates the belief in separateness.
The holy mind is unity.
The God mind only is in unity.
Yeah. So I wonder if what we're talking about is akin to Jesus' remark on the cross when he was questioning if he was being forsaken, remember?
He was actually repeating the 22nd Psalm. That's what he was going. That's what all of that was about.
What was his intent?
As close as I could, from what he said, as close as I could repeat it, it would be to just get past the moment of making the transition.
I think the 22nd Psalm is very assuring. If I
Yeah,
remember
it brought him comfort.
Yeah.
He was just trying to get past that point of pain. But here we are, and I can tell we're all quite amazed at the prospect that if we let one thought go, everything else would change. There's not a thought in our mind that would remain as it is now. Being absolutely perfect would be absolutely acceptable if I did not believe in the idea of sin.